The air inside Halstead University's Grand Hall felt heavy like the quiet before a thunderstorm. Hundreds of students, journalists, and lawmakers packed the room, their murmurs dying down as the two women took the stage. On one side sat Justice Eleanor Vail, her posture straight, her silver hair pulled back in its familiar braid. She was 85 years old, a living legend of the Supreme Court, the kind of name that appeared in textbooks long before most of the audience was born. Across from her stood Representative Maya Torres, the 40-year-old Congresswoman from California, whose fiery speeches and fearless confrontations had made her one of the most viral political figures of her generation. Where Vail's calm radiated control, Torres's presence burned like electricity, unapologetic, bold, and impossible to ignore. The auditorium lights dimmed slightly, focusing on the two women. A hush spread through the crowd. Everyone could sense it. This wasn't going to be another polite discussion about judicial theory or gender equality. It was something deeper, something raw. For weeks, social media had buzzed with anticipation about this event. The university had billed it as a conversation across generations, the future of feminism and the law. But insiders whispered that behind the scenes, tension was already brewing. Torres had publicly criticized Vail's decades of cautious compromise, saying her restraint had allowed injustice to persist. Vail hadn't responded until now. As the moderator welcomed the audience, the contrast between them was striking. Vail's voice, soft but measured, had the calm rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime in courtrooms. Torres's tone, when she spoke, carried the sharp conviction of protest chants echoing through city streets. For a brief moment, the hall seemed to hold its breath. Every camera was trained on the stage. Every phone was recording. What began as a symposium about women and the Constitution was about to turn into something far more explosive, a clash of two philosophies, two generations, and two visions of what justice really means. And before the next hour was over, their confrontation would ignite a nationwide debate and leave the audience questioning everything they thought they knew about progress, power, and how real change is made. Because when patience meets protest, when history faces its future, silence never lasts for long. Justice Eleanor Vail had been shaping the law since long before most of the audience could vote. Her career began in an era when women were still asked during job interviews whether they planned to start a family soon. At a time when courtroom benches were filled entirely with men in dark suits, Vail's quiet persistence carved cracks into the walls of a system that had been sealed for centuries. To her colleagues, she was the definition of precision, every ruling, every dissent written like a blade. Clean, deliberate, unshakable. Her philosophy was simple but powerful: change the system from within, one precedent at a time. Never rush, never shout, just win slowly, steadily, and permanently. But that philosophy, once celebrated as revolutionary, was now under fire. On the other side stood Representative Maya Torres, the storm to Vail's calm. A daughter of immigrant activists, she grew up at protests, megaphone in hand, before she could even spell justice. Her rise to Congress wasn't built on compromise. It was fueled by confrontation. Viral clips of her speeches calling out corruption, demanding accountability, made her a symbol for a generation that refused to wait. To her supporters, she was the voice of urgency in an age of backsliding rights. To her critics, she was reckless, too quick to tear down what others had spent decades building. And yet, despite their differences, the two women shared something profound. Both had spent their lives fighting the same enemy: inequality. Only their weapons were different. Vail wielded logic, precedent, and quiet persuasion. Torres wielded outrage, fire, and public momentum. One built bridges brick by brick. The other kicked down walls that took too long to fall. That contrast was why this moment mattered. It wasn't just a debate, it was a generational collision. A confrontation between the architect of gradual progress and the torchbearer of immediate action. Vail represented the belief that endurance was power, that real change was like erosion, wearing away injustice grain by grain until the shape of the law itself transformed. Torres believed in impact, the kind that doesn't wait for permission, the kind that makes the world turn its head and listen. As the moderator introduced their first topic, the pace of progress in modern America, the atmosphere in the hall tightened. Both women leaned forward slightly, eyes locked, as if the rest of the world had vanished. No one knew it yet, But what was about to unfold wouldn't just be a debate about strategy. It would become a mirror reflecting a question every generation must answer for itself. Is justice built through patience or pressure? The first question from the moderator was meant to be harmless. Justice Vale, Representative Torres, how do you each define progress in today's political climate? But the Congresswoman didn't hesitate. She gripped the microphone like she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. With respect, Torres began, her voice cutting through the air. Progress doesn't come from patience. It comes from pressure. For too long, people in power have told us to wait, to trust the system, to believe that change will come if we just stay polite. But while we've been waiting, rights have been stripped away piece by piece. Her words hit like a hammer. You could feel the air shift in the room. Justice Vale, she continued, turning toward the elder jurist, you've spent decades working within that system. And yes, you've changed laws, written brilliant opinions, and inspired millions. But tell me honestly, how many of those victories are still standing today? How many of those protections have been rolled back by the same forces you tried to persuade? A few gasps echoed through the auditorium. Even the moderator seemed caught off guard by the bluntness. Torres pressed on. Respect across the aisle doesn't protect people from oppression. Civility doesn't stop injustice. You once said that lasting change requires patience. I say patience has been our prison. The hall erupted not in applause but in a low murmur of disbelief. Some leaned forward eagerly. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Cameras zoomed in. Every journalist in the room knew they were witnessing a moment that would explode across headlines before the night was over. Justice Vale didn't flinch. She simply removed her glasses, folded them neatly on the table, and looked at Torres with calm intensity. Her silence spoke louder than any retort. Torres hesitated, but only for a breath. You taught generations of women to believe they could succeed inside the system, she continued, her tone softer now but no less sharp. But what happens when that system stops listening? When the law you built starts to crumble? Maybe it's time we stop asking politely and start demanding change. The crowd's tension thickened until it felt like the whole room might burst. The moderator shifted in his chair, voice shaky. Perhaps we could, Torres interrupted. No, this matters, because young women in this country are watching us tonight. They're tired of slow progress. They're tired of promises that never materialize. They want to know, why should we still believe in patience? The words hung in the air like smoke. Justice Vale sat motionless, her expression unreadable. But those who knew her well could see the faintest tightening of her jaw, a signal that beneath her calm exterior, something was stirring. And what she would say next wouldn't just silence the room, it would change how the nation understood the meaning of justice itself. Justice Vale didn't answer right away. She looked down for a moment, as if searching for the right words among the memories only she could see. Then, in that steady voice that had once commanded the nation's highest court, she began to speak. You know, she said softly, when I graduated from law school, I wasn't allowed to use the front door of the courthouse. The crowd went silent. I had to enter through the side hallway, the one for clerks and assistants, because the front was for men only. A few gasps broke the stillness. Vale continued, her tone neither bitter nor boastful, just factual, sharp with truth. When I applied for my first job at a firm, the hiring partner told me, "You're impressive, Miss Vale, but we already have our woman." They had one. That was the quota. And it was filled. Every eye in the room was locked on her. Even Torres had lowered her gaze slightly, so I fought where I could. I argued cases nobody else would take. I wrote briefs for men who got the credit. And eventually I got my chance to stand in front of that same court that once refused to let me in through the front door. She paused. Her hands rested lightly on the table, her voice calm but firm. Every inch of progress I made was a battle, not because I liked the fight, but because I had to pick the ones I could win. You call it patience, Representative Torres. I call it survival. The words hit hard. The audience didn't breathe. Vale leaned slightly forward, her eyes meeting Torres's. You say the system doesn't listen. I agree, it rarely does. But when I couldn't shout, I learned how to whisper in the right ears. When I couldn't break the door, I learned how to slip through the cracks. And sometimes that's how the walls start to crumble. Her voice softened again. I admire your fire. I see myself in it. But fire alone doesn't rebuild what it burns. Torres didn't respond. She just stared, the challenge still in her eyes but now mingled with something else. Understanding, maybe, or doubt. Justice Vale leaned back, folding her hands. The room remained completely still. "Change is never as fast as we want it to be," she said quietly. "But the fight isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who refuses to stop pushing, even when no one's watching." And with that, she fell silent again. The moderator cleared his throat but didn't speak. He didn't need to. The tension that had filled the room moments ago had transformed into something heavier: respect, reflection, and maybe, for the first time that night, unity. But the night was far from over. Because while Vale's words carried the weight of a lifetime, Torres wasn't ready to back down. And what she said next would reignite the fire and push both women to the edge of everything they believed. For a long moment, Representative Torres said nothing. The audience waited, breaths shallow, unsure if the Congresswoman would respond or let the silence honor what had just been said. Then she lifted her microphone. "I respect everything you've been through," she began, her voice steady but simmering with energy beneath the surface. "I can't even imagine what it took to do what you did. But with all due respect, Justice Vale, survival isn't enough anymore." The air crackled again. Torres stood up, not to grandstand, but because sitting still no longer felt possible. "You fought battles in a world that refused to see you," she said, pacing slightly. "And you won. You opened doors for people like me. But those doors? They're closing again, faster than ever." She turned to the audience, scanning the faces in the crowd. "We're losing ground on equality, on rights, on basic human decency. And every time we ask why, we're told to be patient, to wait for the system to correct itself. But what if the system was never built to serve us in the first place?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded, others frowned, torn between admiration and discomfort. Torres turned back to Vale. "You taught us to believe in the law, to trust its promise. But what do we do when that promise is broken? When the same institutions that once advanced progress now roll it back?" Her voice rose slightly, not angry, but urgent, passionate. "You say fire doesn't rebuild what it burns? Maybe not. But sometimes fire is the only thing that clears the path for something new to grow." The words hung in the air like sparks, alive and dangerous. Justice Vale didn't interrupt. She sat still, eyes fixed on Torres, not defensive, not dismissive, just listening. Torres exhaled, her tone softening. "You see patience as strength. I see it as surrender. Maybe that's the difference between us. You had to work quietly because the world wouldn't let you be loud. But now that we can be loud, shouldn't we use that power? Shouldn't we demand the change you once had to negotiate for?" The audience erupted, some in applause, others in uneasy murmurs. It was the kind of moment that divides opinion but commands attention. Torres lowered her microphone, the emotion still flickering in her expression. For the first time that night, she looked less like a politician and more like a woman wrestling with history, fighting not just an opponent, but the ghost of every compromise that came before her. Justice Vale finally broke her stillness. She leaned toward her microphone, eyes calm, almost compassionate. "Miss Torres," she said softly, "you're right about one thing." Torres blinked, surprised. "The doors are closing again. But that's why we need both kinds of fighters, the ones who hold the line and the ones who break it open." The room fell utterly silent. Vale's voice was low, but every word carried weight. "You think patience is surrender? But the truth is, patience is discipline. The kind that keeps the fire alive long enough to outlast every storm." The audience froze between two truths, fire and stone, impulse and endurance, and for a brief electric moment both women seemed to understand each other. The storm hadn't ended. It had only changed form. And what came next would turn their confrontation into something no one in that room or across the country would ever forget. Justice Vale didn't rush to respond. She let the echoes of Torres's last words settle into the air like dust after a collapse. The audience waited, phones lifted, fingers trembling. knowing that whatever came next would define the night. Then, quietly, she began. "You remind me," Vale said, "of myself at your age, angry, certain, and absolutely right to be both." The crowd stirred. Torres blinked, caught off guard by the admission. Vale continued, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the room. "You said survival isn't enough. And you're right. It's not. But survival is the reason you're able to stand here and demand more. The reason you have the platform to shout, to challenge, to lead, because a generation of women before you learned to fight quietly, so you could fight loudly." She leaned slightly forward, the faintest glint of emotion in her eyes. "I didn't stay patient because I wanted to. I stayed patient because the world punished women who weren't. You call it slow progress, I call it laying the foundation for the speed you now command." The crowd murmured, captivated. Vale's tone shifted, still gentle but edged with steel. "Do you know what happens to a movement that burns too hot? It consumes itself. I've seen it, righteous anger turning into chaos, unity dissolving into noise. You can't build a future on ashes alone." She paused, then delivered a line that would be quoted, replayed, and stitched across every social feed in the country. "Movements are like rivers. The loudest waves crash fast, but it's the steady current beneath that shapes the land." The audience gasped. Some clapped, others just stared. The metaphor landed with quiet force, the kind that doesn't just sound profound, but feels true. Vale pressed on. "Your fire is necessary, Representative Torres. It reminds the world that change won't wait forever. But don't mistake noise for impact. The law changes when the story changes, when the hearts of the people behind it begin to shift. And hearts don't move because they're shouted at. They move because they're shown a better way." Torres listened, expression unreadable. This wasn't the clash she expected. It wasn't condescension. It was understanding delivered from someone who had already walked through every version of the same fire. Vale leaned back, her final words soft, almost reflective. "You are the future. And the future needs fire. But don't forget, every flame burns brighter when it's carried by hands that remember how long the dark can last." The room erupted, not in chaos this time, but in a deep, resonant applause that rolled like thunder. Some stood, some wiped tears. And for a rare, perfect moment, two generations so different, yet bound by the same cause, stood in the same light. But the story didn't end there, because that exchange, raw and unfiltered, would escape the walls of that auditorium and ignite a nationwide debate, one that neither woman could control. The applause went on longer than anyone expected. It wasn't the kind of applause that bursts out of excitement. It was slower, heavier, carrying the weight of realization. The kind that says something just changed here. Torres sat back down, her expression caught somewhere between awe and defiance. She hadn't been silenced, she'd been seen, and that was somehow even more disarming. When the noise finally faded, the moderator cleared his throat and leaned toward his mic. "Well," he said, voice trembling slightly, "I think we've just witnessed history." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, but it was uneasy because everyone in that hall knew the moment wasn't over. Torres picked up her microphone again, slower this time. "Justice Vale," she said quietly, "I didn't come here to disrespect what you've done. I came here because I'm terrified. Terrified that everything you built is slipping away and that my generation doesn't know how to stop it." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't political. It was human. Vale looked at her for a long moment, eyes softening. "Fear is where courage begins," she replied. "The fact that you're afraid means you understand the stakes. But don't let fear trick you into thinking the fire has to burn alone." Torres blinked, caught off guard again, not by the wisdom but by the kindness in it. For the first time that night she smiled. A real one. "Maybe I've been too busy shouting to notice who's still standing beside me." Vale nodded slightly. "And maybe I've been too busy defending the old fights to see how the new ones are being waged." It wasn't a truce exactly. It was something rarer, mutual recognition. Two paths converging at last. The audience, still quiet, began to sense the shift. What started as a clash was turning into a conversation. What began as confrontation was becoming connection. Torres leaned toward her mic once more. "So maybe," she said, "it isn't patience or pressure. Maybe it's both. Maybe progress needs people who push from the outside and people who build from within." Justice Vale's response was simple. Exactly. Change needs the spark and the structure to hold its light. The hall erupted again, but this time the sound was different. No tension, no division. Just energy relief, admiration, unity. That moment the handshake between two generations was captured from a dozen angles and shared online before they even left the stage. By sunrise, clips of the exchange would dominate every feed. Headlines calling it the debate that redefined feminism. Two icons, one movement, and when fire met stone. What neither woman expected was how that moment would follow them, twisting, spreading, reshaping how millions viewed their own fight for change. Because the true shock wasn't that they disagreed. It was that they found a way to listen. By dawn, the clip had already traveled farther than anyone in that auditorium could have imagined. A 2-minute video, Vale's calm, unshakable voice countering Torres's fire, dominated every corner of the internet. Hashtags lit up across platforms. Fire meets stone, Vale vs Torres, the long game. Some called it a revolution in real time. Others simply wrote, "I can't stop thinking about this." Newsrooms scrambled to analyze what had just happened. Morning shows ran split screens of the two women, Vale, the scholar of structure, and Torres, the insurgent of passion. Editorials appeared before breakfast. The Washington Post called it a generational dialogue disguised as a debate. The Guardian wrote, "Neither woman won. Progress did." On college campuses, law professors rewrote their lectures overnight. "Watch this," they told their students, playing the viral clip. "This is what advocacy looks like when intellect meets conviction." Civil rights organizations issued statements praising both women, one for her legacy, the other for her fire. But the ripple went deeper than headlines. In small offices and community centers, young activists started talking differently. The usual arguments, patience versus protest, courts versus streets, sounded smaller now, less like rivals, more like pieces of the same fight. At one law school in Atlanta, a student stood up during class and said, "I used to think I had to choose between being like Vale or Torres. Now I think I can be both." The room applauded. Even in Congress, where polarization was the norm, something unexpected happened. Members on opposite sides of the aisle shared the clip not to argue, but to acknowledge the power of respectful confrontation. "We could use more of this," one senator tweeted. It was retweeted 1,000,000 times. Justice Vale, ever the pragmatist, returned quietly to her chambers. She declined interviews, issuing only one statement through her clerk. "I am encouraged that our exchange reminded people that disagreement can be dignified, and that conviction need not cancel civility." Torres, meanwhile, found herself facing a new kind of attention. Invitations poured in from talk shows, universities, advocacy groups. But she chose to release just a single reflection on social media. "I came to challenge a legacy. I left reminded that legacy and progress aren't enemies, they're chapters in the same story." Within weeks, schools began incorporating the Georgetown exchange into curriculums. Nonprofits launched mentorship programs pairing seasoned advocates with young organizers. The National Bar Association announced a new annual symposium titled "The Fire and the Foundation." What had begun as confrontation had become collaboration. And yet the real impact couldn't be measured in trending hashtags or televised debates. It was quieter, steadier, echoing in the way people spoke to each other. The patience they offered, the bridges they began to rebuild. Because sometimes progress doesn't come from a policy or a ruling. Sometimes it starts with a single conversation that refuses to end in division. Long after the headlines faded, the true legacy of that night continued to unfold, not in courts or Congress, but in the countless minds that replayed the exchange again and again. Some remembered Torres's unflinching defiance, that electric honesty that shook the room. Others couldn't forget Vale's calm precision, the quiet power of a woman who had spent decades learning when to strike and when to stand still. But the real lesson wasn't about who was right. It was about what happens when two truths collide and refuse to destroy each other. Torres had brought the fire, the urgency of now, the impatience of those who can't afford to wait. Vale had brought the stone, the weight of history, the understanding that real change doesn't survive unless it's built to last. Alone, each was incomplete. Together, they revealed the full anatomy of progress. Because change is never just a shout or a strategy, it's the tension between both. The energy of the streets and the precision of the courtroom. The anger that demands movement and the discipline that keeps it moving forward. And maybe that's why the world couldn't look away. It wasn't a fight. It was a mirror reflecting our own struggle to balance passion with patience, vision with structure, outrage with endurance. In the years that followed, people began to quote Vail's words as often as Torres's. Movements that once dismissed the long game started to build deeper strategies. Lawmakers who once feared confrontation began to welcome it as the spark of honesty. The ripple became rhythm, a new cadence in the pursuit of justice. And when asked years later what she took from that night, Torres didn't hesitate. She said simply, "I learned that a flame burns longer when it's grounded in stone. That's the real lesson. Progress isn't one voice shouting louder than another. It's the harmony that happens when conviction meets wisdom and refuses to let go."